welcome to Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast with Renae Hanvin, which is all about inspiring you to start thinking and doing disasters a little bit differently too. In this episode, I'm talking with James Ritchie, who's director of Thamani, and he's a principal consultant with our Corporate to Community collective. And we're talking about adding all hazards resilience to the CEO's agenda. A little bit about James. James brings diverse senior executive leadership experience from the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. He has previously worked in senior positions across diverse sectors, including international development, environment, water, Australian state government public service, community mental health, and mining sectors. James has also had executive leadership accountability and expertise in disaster risk and resilience governance and strategy. James has held various disaster preparedness and emergency management responsibilities across his career, in particular executive accountability for fire and flood response, counter-terrorism planning, and emergency evacuation. James is passionate about enabling people and their organisations to drive and deliver the best value outcomes through leadership, strategy, change management and reform, using strong collaborative decision-making processes. James holds an MBA and a commerce degree in business management and industrial relations. James also holds an international diploma in humanitarian assistance from Fordham University in New York in America, and has completed expert training in disaster risk reduction management in Berlin. James recently was accredited as an International Resilience Advisor for the European International Resilience Advisors Network. James, thanks for joining me.
All right, Renae, thank you very much for having me.
Now, I like to start with where we met, and James and I met about 8 or 9 years ago in the disaster space when he was presenting at a course that I attended when I worked at Australia Post, and we connected and have been working together in various ways ever since. And when I had left Post and was consulting to Emergency Management Victoria, I was mapping out corporate to community as a concept. And I asked James out for a coffee for his thoughts. And it's about 5 or 6 years later, and we haven't stopped talking about it, have we, James?
No, it's been an ongoing conversation. And may I say, a very engaging and thoughtful and insightful conversation we've had along the way.
We have. And I have to say, I have to give full credit because I would not be where I am or corporate to community is now without James' support. And he gives so much generous time, and it's been great to work with him on creating and developing and implementing so many of these initiatives. So firstly, thank you, James. There's lots more to come.
For me, Renae, that's one of the things for me is, I've always had a premise these days of I want to work with good people doing good things to get good outcomes. And it's the first thing I recognised many years ago was with you about how do we actually start to solve these problems and issues that we're seeing across the sector, but across the community and across government and the private sector.
Yeah, and I have to say, James, I think working with you has just been so amazing because we have different backgrounds and different experience. But again, it's all about coming together as people and then having, the similar outcomes that we want to deliver against, and then bringing our expertise and collaborating on collective outcomes, which I think is why we are where we are with some great initiatives and programs that we are launching and have been working on. Now, let's start with, where do we start? You've got such an amazing experience. You're currently in Germany, where you've been for the past, you went for about 3 months, and with COVID, you've obviously been there for a little bit longer.
Yes.
Now, let's start with, what was it about my C2C corporate to community concept that you were most interested in when we started speaking about it so many years ago?
Okay. So one thing, the first driver for me is one we obviously met at that program, and one connected on an individual, personal basis. But the first thing that got me was, and I'm always driven by both cultural things and individual people, but firstly was your passion. For me, it was about the passion of, we've got to do something. We've got to get, we've got to improve. We've got to look at how do we fill these gaps. So for me, we're aligned in, as you say, we come from very different perspectives and training and expertise and experience. But for me, it was a bit about, here is somebody in front of me saying, do you see these things? Am I right? Am I checking? Am I driving? How do I actually change things? And we knew that the things we were talking about are very, very complex. They've got some big issues with them. And what I liked was, one, your systematic thinking about it, but also that knowing that we had to reform, and that there's both at a level of process, practical and systemic and institutional change has to happen. And for me, that was exciting to me, because you're sitting there going, we may not have all the answers, but how do we get everybody in the room, and how do we actually get the things to solve? And we've come in those period of time that's really now really sharpened our thinking over the last few years about what are the gaps, what are the strategic issues for communities, businesses, governments. How do we link them up? How do we talk better? And one of the best things for me when one of our first meetings, Renae, was you had said, there's all these great things like shared responsibility, but nobody knows what they mean, and nobody's defined them. And how do we get the right people talking? How do we get CEOs on the agenda? How do we get? And so for me, that was as I said before, for me it was an attractive problem to start working with. And as I said, I want to work with good people doing good things, getting good outcomes.
And it's interesting, James, because we've spoken about the same things for a number of years, and we've talked to a lot of people at very high levels of government, and CEOs and businesses and associations. And we've often talks about how people nod and say, yep, completely get what you're saying, understand the relevance, but no, we're just not there. We've been positioned as being so ahead of the time. Even Mark Croswell has said to me many years ago, you are so far ahead of the notion of resilience. But I kind of think now that all those conversations we have had, and not that it's a I told you so, but very much I know conversations I've been having now is more about, this is what I was talking about. This is what I'm meaning by the, future era of disasters, and how we need to think differently.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Renae, because one of the things that keep telling, I can remember one of our first conversations was sitting there talking about bushfires and floods and all that sort of stuff, and we were already recognising that, well, what happens if it becomes more complex or more compounding? How do you deal with that disaster? But then how do you manage the risk? But then more importantly, then how do you get resilient in managing those, both at all levels, from, as we're seeing currently now, how do you become economically resilient as a community? How do you become business resilient? How do you become individually resilient? How do you get the community resilience? And you sit there and you say, we may have been thinking about these things, which I think places us to sort of help respond to these things, but it is, there's increasing disasters, both natural and unnatural, which are having greater impacts on businesses, communities and governments. And if it's not the time to actually break down the silos, and working together makes us stronger, how do we actually do that? And how do we actually navigate that process? I personally think, corporate to community is in that position where they're actually able to do that. And as the translator, but as a communicator, but more importantly, as a action-orientated group of people to actually make a difference.
Yeah, and I think that's what I guess is exciting for me, in the sense that, having had all those conversations for the past many years with multiple stakeholder groups, that now everyone's sort of coming to us and starting to say, right, okay, we're ready now, let's start doing. Now, corporate to community kind of begun from the notion that I felt there's a greater role for businesses to play in helping communities before, during and after disasters. And you alluded to shared responsibility, which was recognised in the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience in 2011. So we're pretty much nearly 10 years later. Now, the business model for corporate to community, we've kind of grown a bit broader than just being businesses helping communities, because we're about, obviously, businesses helping businesses as well, and businesses working with government. What do you kind of feel like? Why do you think our model's kind of expanded a bit?
Well, I think it's in some ways a natural progression, just because the nature of, your corporate community, and both with the experience of both yourself, me, and the other people in the collective, we all see disasters in very different ways in the way they impact businesses. But one of the key things we do see is that silos are really unpacking those silos and saying, well, how do we actually make 1+1 = 3? How do we get better value or better outcomes for all people in that sort of, that sort of process and that supply chain, for a better word? And I think it's naturally morphed into corporate to community saying, well, we have to bring the right players in at the right time to make a right difference, and in some ways bring, for example, bring the CEOs and their teams along the journey. It's been surprising for me over these past few years of going to meetings where people in one department of a big organisation doesn't know the other people in the organisation, and we've connected them up.
Yeah, there's been a few corporates, hasn't there, that I've met with and then introduced the head of sustainability and social impact with the head of risk management or business continuity.
And that has been a big surprise to me. So I sit there and say, so naturally, I think corporate community has, because of one, the nature of how you've set it up, but also the business model, but also the needs have developed that way, where we've become, for many organisations, that connector of whether it's intelligence or whether it's facts or connections or subject matter expertise. They're all starting to sit there and say, well, how do we actually all join up together, and how do we work better together internally to make resilience part of our, for a better word, strategy/business planning, but actually also how do we connect properly with the stakeholders we deal with, whether that's customers, clients, communities, governments, whatever, because there's been a long discussion, and as you know, I'm an I've worked in government and in various different sectors. One of the key things in that connection is people talk about, we've got great connections with our stakeholders and all that sort of stuff, but often it's just a one-way conversation. What we're about is how do we actually have the right conversation, but to actually to deliver a better outcome, not just have a talk. It's actually how do we actually make a difference.
Correct. And I think it's, it's outcomes, not outputs, that, we often talk about. And also, the stakeholders, it's got to be two ways. So for effective resilience building, and, I love the work that Daniel Aldrich does in the sense that people build resilience, not buildings or bridges. But we need it to be two ways. So it's not about, government telling communities what to do. It's got to be about collective building of resilience at a national, state and local level.
I think that's right, Renae. I think you're right on the money, because I do think that's, the connectivity with people seeing resilience, especially in local communities or governments or even private industry. It's all about fixed infrastructure or capital infrastructure. In my experience, the building's important, but if you don't bring the social capital as the lead to it,
executive leadership teams in corporate organizations or any organization really, resilience is probably, I guess, within the business continuity or the risk management kind of siloed area. And very much the focus is on, the business operations for the majority of businesses. But I've always been adamant that any contribution by businesses associated with disasters, so whether it's contributing to preparedness or prevention or response or recovery, actually requires a twofold focus, being organizational resilience, so the business obviously being ready to adapt to keep the business in business, but also community resilience in the sense that the corporates have a role to adapt to support communities to continue being able to, thrive and survive with the disasters ahead. Given the disasters that we've recently had and we're currently experiencing, obviously, with COVID, do you think this twofold focus is more or less important for CEOs today?
I think the world of the business world, whether it's small business, medium business, or a large entity, the reality is that the twofold focus is more important, because at the end of the day, if you think of business strategy or planning, and I've been in, executive management in large corporations in the private and not-for-profit sectors as well as government, if you do not embed things like resilience into your business planning and the way you think about the scenarios that may impact your business, I think one is you're not looking at some of the biggest critical risks, but also you're missing some of the critical opportunities for your business, both at a cultural level and also as a output level or an outcome level for your business. So I think you've got to break down this. They've got to break down the silos. And historically, and I've had to look after business continuity and risk for organisations. And what's fascinating is it's often looked at through a lens of just a silo, and it's a compliance. Give me a box to fill out. Give me something to tick. Have I done all my 50 papers on being prepared? Have I got my service level agreements right? Have I got my recovery times right? Have I ticked the box that I've done my risk management framework to ISO 31000? I don't discount those things, but I don't think CEOs and executive teams are using that information strategically to embed resilience into their business.
So is it a bit like gone are the days of doing your ISOs and not to say that they don't have a place, because they absolutely do, but completing your frameworks and your documentation and then filing them in the cloud or putting them on the bookshelf, those days are gone. It's now got to be seeded right across the business, everyday business as usual.
Yeah, because it's so impactful these days, because they're getting complex, because they're getting compounding, because they're coming from different ways they're impacting business. And the good old days of, we'll just wait because government will tell us what to do. There's such complex disasters these days. If you're waiting for government, you're 2 steps behind, and you're the chance of you recovering post disaster is so much harder, as we know. Not many, there's up to 2/3 that don't sort of come back from a major disaster. Well, you've got to be ahead of the game, and you've got to think strategically about resilience. It's great because everything has I call it a framework underneath, or processes underneath that you have to have. Like I could have a wonderful risk register with my top 100 risks, but what do I do with it? How do I strategically link that to my business strategy, my business model, the way we do it? How do I build it into our culture? Because it is a changing landscape. We are in a very different world, and if CEOs and leadership teams aren't putting that on their agenda, they are possibly being forced to at the moment because of things like COVID. But how do you build that into that? This is the new normal. We are going to be confronted by significant, no matter what we call them, significant disasters, incidents, business shocks. If we are not embedding that into our culture, but also into our business strategy, well, as I said, you'll miss the opportunities that come with that risk, as well as there's the downside of risk that it actually may stop your business.
Absolutely. Now, it makes me think about, the sustainable development goals. So they were the big thing a few years ago that businesses were embracing, and they were reporting against, and they were integrating sustainable, development goals like, logistics, supply chains and procurement, et cetera, into their cultural values. But we've had many conversations with CEOs on the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and the National Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, asking who was integrating disaster risk reduction, and got many, many blank looks back from, again, CEOs and executive teams. So when it comes to CEOs and resilience and disaster risk reduction, it hasn't been a strategic priority. But why do you think it hasn't?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think there's one is it's just not been part of their normal conversation, particularly in Australia. It's interesting sitting, in some cases, having to sit out COVID across Europe here. It is a different conversation, and even culturally, that you see happening across the business sector. I suspect in Australia, particularly, and in smaller markets, CEOs are more worried about what happens in the next 2 weeks. How do I get my profit running? How do I do the day-to-day stuff? They just get pushed out of thinking about these things because their short-term vision is being, the pressure from the board, pressure from stakeholders, pressure from, shareholders, all these sort of things. They sort of start to, I think, overwhelm some CEOs and some executive teams. But I think it's remiss if they don't start to think about that now, because the other thing is resilience and risk has also been some of the things I said. It's been a compliance activity. We've got to, we've had to make sure we have a risk framework to tell shareholders, but they don't embed it into strategy properly because some of them are winging it on the seat of the pants, and that's how they've always done it, and their their entrepreneurial type approach, and we don't want to quell that at all. But you need to make sure as an executive team, as a CEO, that particularly resilience, but also sort of preparedness around disasters is front and center in your business model and in your business strategy.
Yeah, and I'd like to, we'd assume that given the disasters, the unprecedented bushfires, which obviously impacted a lot of businesses, and then obviously COVID, which has impacted pretty much every business, you'd like to think that now, disaster risk reduction and resilience, disaster resilience and response and recovery is, I guess, making its way to the top of the strategic priority. So if we have CEOs listening to us now from medium and large organizations in particular, what is it they need to be doing right now? Obviously, apart from responding to the the current state of play and the changing state of play from a business continuity perspective, but if they were looking at disaster resilience, what is it that they need to start doing right now?
Well, I think it's you sort of, for me, it's looking at how do you put an all hazards resilience approach across your business. How do you look at the strategic priority? What does it start the process by? How do you integrate resilience across your business? What's your purpose? How does it meet? What's your processes? What's your culture? Have a think about what does it look like that they keep disasters on the top of the top of strategic thinking, because it's the stuff that stops your business. And this is the business critical information is what's the things that you need to operate, what's the things that you'll keep your planning, get rid of silos. You have to have silos from a structural point of view for reporting lines, but you don't have to have silos to understand strategic issues. And it's time to move into that holistic position across your whole business. It's a business imperative, whether you, as I said before, and this applies to whether you're a small, medium business or a large corporate. You have to stop to think about your whole business. What is its purpose? How does its processes? What's the culture? But more importantly, what are the all hazard risks, and how do we actually make ourselves more resilient? And then start to think about, what are the objectives? Australia are signatories to, as you said, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We are signatories to the Sustainable Development Goals. How do we as businesses and how do we as CEOs and leaders meet those and exceed those expectations, one of the community, but also to better prepare our business? To go back to just the different cultural viewpoints between, say, Europe and Australia, one thing I've noticed here, you talk to a CEO here, they've heard about the Sendai Framework. They're sometimes not sure about what it means to them, but it's actually on their agenda. You go to talk to them about Sustainable Development Goals, most of them, the majority of them will know about it, and it will be embedded into their business. They'll be thinking about what do the measures mean, how do we deal with it, what does it mean for our own business or our connections, our supply chains, and even community-wise, most of the there's many cities across Europe that will have something like it. I know it's a symbolic thing, but they'll have their national flag, their state flag, and the SDG flag on a pole.
Wow.
Where I've never seen that conversation or seen those sorts of things symbolically in Australia at all.
No. It's embedded much more in the culture over there, I guess.
Exactly. And so even their workforce talk about the SDGs and they're driving it internally to businesses. Well, lots of people, I think, in particularly in Australia and particularly in the US, in some contexts, they see the SDGs is only for the developing world, the developing world, not for the developed world, not for, and you sit there and go, well, no. If you talk to most of them here, it's how do we build sustainable processes with our people, our processes, our assets, our infrastructure, the communities we work with. And I just get a sense, and it's my observation, and I'm happy to be challenged by it, but I just get a sense is they've progressed more in that conversation than we are back in Australia.
So maybe, James, our challenge to ourselves is to get a disaster risk reduction flag in every capital city
Yeah,
around Australia.
yeah,
See how
I'm
we
up
go.
for that.
Can I ask you, so I was invited and I ran a workshop with a corporate a couple of weeks ago because they were wanting, the executive team and their social impact team were wanting to understand the disaster landscape more. And a 20-minute conversation ended up being about 40 minutes because the landscape is quite complex and it is very siloed and it's kind of a bit tricky to navigate if you haven't been in it for obviously as long as we have. But from a CEO perspective and executive leadership team, do you think there's benefit for them to better understand the disaster landscape so they can then identify the role they can play under the shared responsibility umbrella?
Well, I think they do. I think they need to learn about that. It's like most things. You don't have to be an expert in it, but I think you have to have an understanding of it because, as I said, any significant business impact or shock that may present to your business, I think it's beholden on the CEO and the executive team to understand the environment and understand the landscape. I think that's imperative. It is a bit about also making sure that you engage with people that have that expertise to give you the quick step ladder up into it and get you across it really quickly.
More so than probably a lot of others, is also about consequences. So I think a lot of decisions that the CEOs and leaders are making based on either organizational resilience or, community expectations has consequences. So whether you're giving donations or goodwill or delivering free food, that is obviously much, it's needed, but it has consequences because it can put small businesses in those local communities out of business, or it's giving unwanted goods, or it's giving cash where the cash doesn't actually get to those who's needed. And even from an organizational perspective, looking at organizational resilience and the decisions you're making to change your routes or change your logistics or processes can again have consequences internally and externally from your business.
That's right, Renae. I think because it was one of the where we first met was in fact talking about leadership, consequence management, and then for me it's actually about also how do you link leadership, consequence management, thinking about then what's I'll call it the moral intelligence or the emotional intelligence during disasters. As a leader, how do you actually bring your people with you in during crisis? Is you need to understand during all that sort of information gathering and all the strategic direction in your strategic planning. So if you do it embedded as part of your business, it actually makes better sense from a cultural outcome for your customer cohort or whoever you're dealing with. That is a better outcome, and you're better informed to make better business decisions with true consequence management around it.
Yeah, so integrating disaster resilience as business as usual has many benefits. And I think too, a big area and opportunity that a lot of CEOs and corporate leaders, I think, are not looking at is that out of disasters come opportunities because, our world is different now to what it was a few months ago before COVID, and same with, many bushfire impacted communities, that there are new needs and there are new challenges. So there are commercial opportunities, obviously balanced with a moral contribution and, a goodwill element. But, there are opportunities for businesses that come out of disasters as well.
And I think that's right, Renae. And I think one of the catch cries I keep saying to you often, since we're sort of in different time zones doing different sorts of pieces of work, is the old saying, you have to be adaptable, flexible, and agile has never been truer. But if you do not understand where you're sitting in that landscape and where you're sitting as in your plan and the way you think about your business and the way you understand your business, you may miss those opportunities because you're so worried about the downside of risk. And downside of risk is really important. You cannot, as a CEO, you cannot miss those, but you can miss the greatest of opportunities during disaster and crisis. And those opportunities both have a goodwill, but also have better outcomes for all. And I think we often get hung up with worrying about the downside of risk. And that's, as I said, it's something important, but you also should stop and breathe strategically and say, what are the opportunities to either one, survive or thrive during a crisis or disaster. Because it is about the thriving is an important element to come out the other end. It's not just going to be good enough anymore just to survive and just wither over 5 years to zero.
Yeah, I agree. Can I ask you, CEOs and executive teams who are planning for the next disaster based on the past, are they setting their businesses up for a disaster?
I think they're setting themselves. I think that is probably right, but I think they're actually setting themselves up to being lacking in their thinking, because one of the things is, you can learn from the past, and that's an important element of your intelligence gathering. But it is about actually thinking more strategically about, as I've said before, who would have thought, 2020 we would have had massive bushfires across the whole of Australia, so significantly impacting businesses, communities all across Australia, and then followed up by, within months, a pandemic. So if you're thinking in your stage strategic ways of, what will happen if X happens and Y happens, you've got to think more strategically about that compounding of complex disaster now, because it's not going to go away. Whether it's everything from, as we're seeing, pandemics, climate change, to major bushfires, to cyber terrorism. People are opportunistic now. Everybody's working from home. This is the way to get through your cyber security. What's next? So you've got to start to think about, my view is about, in good planning around this is, learn from the past, but only learn. As in other words, take the lessons, learn them, but also, when you're thinking strategically, think more broadly about what's the complexity, what's the compounding, and what's the, not so much the unimaginable, but what's out there that can really hurt us, because you never know where it may come from.
Yeah, I agree. Now, we were talking a little bit before about shareholders versus stakeholders, and I followed a couple of years ago, I think the United States Business Roundtable had 200 CEOs sign a petition that the purpose of businesses should be stakeholder, not shareholder-led. So basically, they were saying that, no longer is it acceptable, or is it a good business practice to just deliver to shareholders. If they deliver to stakeholders, then businesses will prosper, because they prosper being part of communities, which obviously mirrors very well to our twofold focus on organizational resilience and community resilience. But that, it's hard enough to integrate resilience and, create a resilience culture and processes and systems in an organization alone. Yet involving stakeholders from outside your organization is almost like, a second challenge in itself. What would be the benefits to CEO and executive teams of inviting the likes of their suppliers or their customers or their local community into resilience planning, so scenario planning or anything like that?
Well, that is a really, really good question, Renae. And I think my response to that is actually, when I think about, the stakeholder shareholder conversation, is I actually think one feeds the other. If you think of it as a system, as a business system, your interactions with your stakeholders is far more impactful than your shareholders in the longevity and the connectivity of your business. I'm not saying I discount the shareholder, because they often give you the money to operate, but it is a bit about your stakeholders. And I'll say something a little bit weird for people, is I have a view, especially in sort of complex businesses, there is very, very few times that somebody understands every element of your business. They are so complex, and I've worked in 4 or 5 different sectors at very senior level. You think you understand your business, you think you know everything about it, you think you know everything about the people, the resources, the assets, but may I say, there are blind spots. The thing about bringing stakeholders into that planning session is you uncover some of those blind spots, or or you challenge the assumptions that you thought, especially in the supply chain slash, the delivery model, is that there are things that you would make assumptions about that you are wrong, just plain wrong. And you don't know that until you hear from them. And the only way you can hear from them if they're in that process. And my view, as I said, whether that's really good scenario planning and really good business planning, is you need to get that intelligence gathering and fact gathering, but also understanding their pressure points and their issues makes you a better, stronger business. And in saying that, the other key element that CEOs must do is, it's an old saying, but, culture kills strategy. You've got to work on your culture. If you do not understand your culture, or you think you understand your culture, you've got to be very open to be vulnerable about your culture, to test it, to understand it, to make sure that resilience is embedded into your culture. Otherwise, I think you're setting yourself up for, it might be a medium or a long term, but it's actually setting yourself up for a failure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, James. And I think particularly when it comes to businesses looking at how they can support and contribute to the well-being of communities, so through donations or goodwill, I often use the saying that token is broken. And if you're going to determine a strategy for how you're going to give, it needs to be aligned to your culture, and it needs to be authentic to your culture. Otherwise you'll be, it could really turn on your brand, and it'll be harmful giving, not just necessarily for the community that you're giving to, but definitely harmful for your brand. So I think it works again from both the organizational perspective and also the community resilience perspective as well.
And I think that's right on the money there, Renae. And I think the other thing it does too is, I've been around a long time, and I've said many different sectors, but I sit there and go, if I hear somebody else giving somebody to something else for somebody else, and I sit there and go, yeah, but what outcome did you create? Oh no, we don't care about that.
Yeah.
Oh, we just gave out something, and I go, yeah, but that's our brand value. We're good to, and I go, yeah, but what's the benefit? What's the outcome? What is the game changer? What have you made? Is people's lives better? People's, is there a social capital? Is there infrastructure? What is it that's made a difference? And can you measure it? And can you actually over time sit back and say, that was best value?
Yeah, 100%. I think, to be honest with you, we could probably have a whole other podcast conversation about corporate giving. Now, since we met many, many years ago, both you and I have been researching. We've been very interested in, on a number of levels, what's happening in Australia and overseas from a resilience perspective. And we've been looking at models about how business leaders can integrate resilience. We've created the Resilient Ready methodology, and not to turn this into a sales program, but I think it's relevant and important to have a conversation about it and integrate it into this conversation, because Resilient Ready is applicable for all business types and sizes, and it focuses on 4 Ps, being prevent, prepare, promote, and protect. A lot of people who I've been introducing it to is like, promote. Why on earth would you want to promote disasters and disaster resilience? So I'm going to ask you, why do you think does this model resonate with CEOs and executive teams?
Well, I think it's it's about that promote thing is actually about the culture. But firstly, it's about us, firstly coming into an organisation to do a resilience plan. The resilience really approach is about us facilitating the internal knowledge. So for us to understand, are you prepared? Are you promoting it across your organisation? Are you protecting? Are you preventing? It's about us helping to identify the risks, the gaps, and the opportunities. And when following the 4P process, we sort of go into the sort of 2 key areas under each P. So it's a bit about, how do we understand where the business is now? Where does it need to be? So for me, it's about when CEOs engage us, we have to integrate the resilience ready approach across their business. We are helping them to help themselves. So it's about us throwing a lens and a light onto the different areas holistically across their business. And are they prepared? Are they promoting good resilience? Are they protecting it? Are they preventing it? So most disaster readiness and risk management and business continuity approaches, as you know, I've said many times, is they're in that silo approach, and they sit within separate business areas. They sometimes talk, sometimes they don't talk, sometimes they have cultural wars. If you get all those people in the room and you start to think about holistically about the business, it's their time to shine, really. And in fact, I was on a webinar the other day with a whole lot of business continuity people in America, and they were all in these tactical areas. And I just kept saying to them, this is your time to shine, to join the dots between business continuity, risk and resilience, and start to drive what we see is that the 4P model of resilience, of how do we prevent it, how do we prepare for it, how do we promote it, and how do we protect it. I think that's for me, it's a really, really simple approach in some ways, but it's the complexity of actually saying, how will we clearly understand our business? And for me, then, if I look at, we have purposely added the promote bit, as you were saying before, Renae. People, why do we want to promote it? That's based on your experience and my experience and the insights in that we talk about disaster resilience, readiness, response, recovery as business as usual. The faster it becomes as business as usual, the better businesses will be. So you need to embed it. People are seeing the impacts of disasters in their homes, at their workplaces, in their communities. If you embed it and promote it, one is it does two things. One is it keeps it front of mind, front of center, keeps it part of the business strategy and business implementation, but it also becomes a cultural tool that people will raise it when it needs to be raised about the issues around business resilience. And if you get people engaged and they become your resilience champions, that is a great step forward as a business model.
Yeah, and I think, as you alluded to and mentioned before, a big part, well, apart from the fact that, corporate to community is all about doing disasters differently, and I've never gone into a meeting or a webinar these days or a conversation that I haven't kind of thrown a spanner into the conversation where everyone's had a bit of an aha moment. You're correct. If we can prevent and we can prepare, but if we don't promote and talk about it, then it's not going to mean anything to anyone outside those siloed people who have responsibility for it.
Yep.
And I think, the final P that we have developed being protect, it's ultimately everyone's responsibility to protect and to integrate a disaster resilience mindset. So while it's led by the CEO and the leadership team, it's actually every single person in every business and every customer and every supplier associated with those businesses has a role to play under shared responsibility. So to protect the prevention and the planning and the conversations being had will absolutely enhance the business's ability to, integrate resilience and be ready for future disasters ahead. From a CEO level, can I ask you, James, who's doing disaster resilience, response and recovery well?
One of the, for me, watching from afar, which is really interesting because you get a different insight and just a response to thinking about these things. But if you look at from across the bushfires and COVID response, from a leadership terms, the business communications, business adaptability and stakeholder relations, you'd have to say Woolworths are doing a very good job of it. It would be my view from outside looking in, just the way they're going about it. I think the leadership from Brad Baducci has been exemplar in that. I think he's done a really good example of how to be a corporate CIO role model, both in the way they're doing some things practically, the way they're looking at the way even internally about how they talk to each other, how they promote it. I think they're doing an exemplar job, would be my view.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think they, from both, recent disasters being the Black Summer bushfires and also COVID-19, I think they're definitely leading the way. And I think a lot of that has to do with, I connected with Matt Riley, who is their group, I think he's head of group security maybe in resilience, and he has a great background in resilience, and they've identified that being a important role within their business that I think in the likes of what's happened over the past 6 months has actually made a big difference to their business because they have someone who's driving resilience and pulling the holistic resilience across the business.
Yeah, I think from my view, the thing I think that what I've been seeing and observing is, you know, they've got a strategic driver in resilience, and they've got a leadership team saying this is important to us because it's an important business driver, not just a good thing to do. They're connecting both those things up, and I think that's the challenge. And I think from many executive teams, that's the challenge: is how do you connect your, I call it, we all put business structures in place of reporting lines, but how do you connect the business drivers and the business connectors to business strategy, and how do you do it well for stakeholders, for yourself, for your people, for your resources, all those things? It's not easy, but it's when you see it done well, it's actually it's refreshing.
Yeah, and I think I think Woolworths and Brad's leadership is a great example of the difference, thinking about and integrating and including resilience as a cultural priority has in terms of readying a business to be able to respond effectively. And, right across the board, their response from a corporate social responsibility has been very impressive, and their communications internally and externally in, really trying times and very noisy times, a lot of communication's been going out. But I think, you clearly understood what they as a business were doing. You could understand what they stood for. And I think, definite early adopter leadership in the resilience space. Now, not going to name names. I don't want you to name names.
No.
Because we don't want to get into any more trouble than I normally do. But who's not done it so well?
Well, I think there's a number of examples out there, both in the bushfire and the COVID experience, but there has been, there is ineffective leadership, and as I said, we won't name names, but what I have seen is often, and it's one of my pet peeves is, around leadership, it's a bit about stepping up, and it's a bit about saying, when I hear businesses blaming others for their inability to change or they don't know they need a need for change as such. That's a sort of double negative there. But there's been a great number of examples in the supply chain, logistics supply chain, of examples where businesses will blame others. They'll say, "Oh no, it's not my job, not my role, not my responsibility. That's others." And you sit there and you start to go, and if they're not open to change or think about what are the strategic opportunities in this, this is what I get frustrated about. Is there are strategic opportunities in this for these businesses, but they go, "Oh no, it wasn't us, it was somebody else," and they don't think about the consequences. For example, in some of them is, if you've got a supply chain and there's local regional areas aren't getting food, the consequence of that's dramatic for those areas. Admittedly, COVID restrictions make that, they turn supply chains into a very sort of, they have turned it on its head, but in many ways that's going to bring or it should be looking for the opportunities of efficiencies, and how do we work together in this? But for those like, Woolworths and Coles that have adapted well, they get rewarded for it. So I sit there and go, why aren't some people learning from this and saying, actually, there's a great opportunity here, instead of putting up the wall and the barrier? Or, one of my pet peeves is organisations go, "Oh, James, you don't understand. My business is unique." And I go,
we're all unique, aren't we?
"Oh, yeah, I get that your outputs might be unique or your outcomes might be unique, but many businesses are the same." And I sit there and, why don't you stop strategically and learn from what are others doing well? How do we adapt that to our business? How do we make it good for us? And how do we respond to that? And then how do we actually make it where, we get the benefit from being resilient, ready for when these things happen? We are on the front foot, we're making a difference, and we're getting, the other side of it is you get brand recognition, you get all these other add-ons, and you get people going to you, "Actually, that was so well done. I respect that." And I, to be honest, haven't seen that too many times in the Australian model, because it's often led from, "Oh, we're waiting for government to come and ask us," or "We're waiting for somebody to ask," or "We're waiting," instead of going, actually, leadership is about, especially authentic leadership, is about stepping up. What needs to happen? How do we make it happen? How do we bring the right people in the room? How do we make a difference? Because that'll come back to us twofold, if not threefold.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I think uh, effective integration of resilience in organizations requires leaders, like CEO leaders. So those who are going to wait and follow, I think, will be missing out on some big opportunities. And also, I think following's fine, because in disasters we want everyone to obviously survive and thrive to an extent, but it's those that are not even they're not even accepting the fact that change is required, and they don't want to change, or they don't want to participate in a change. And I've been on a couple of government roundtable conversations, and just been quite alarmed at the fact that everyone's in their siloed, this is our organization, this is how we've done it for 20 years, this is the only way that we're going to do it, we don't care what the consequences are, we don't want to change, we're not going to change, so stop asking us to change, which I find has been quite an eye-opener for me, definitely with a few organizations that you would think, because their purpose and their reasoning is to serve a particular stakeholder group that is not being able to serve, but they're not really wanting to do much more than their old school business as usual to deliver it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think for me also, one of the things is everybody's wanting everybody else to do something. And I must admit, it's an old pet peeve of mine, but we all talk about, we've got to have a public-private partnership between government and private sector. And to be honest, they've got to throw a bomb in that stuff and just actually start to think about, how do we do this authentically, and how do we do this with meaning and with the right intent, moving away from being just a contractual arrangement. How do we actually truly make public-private partnerships beneficial for all in that game? And actually, how do we actually make it that we actually make a difference to the communities we serve, whether that's customers or whether it's your community from a government point of view, and what role the government plays in that. I think there's, the resilient ready model, and the conversation we have to have is, we have to start innovating in a real meaningful way and stop having lots of conversations without any outcome.
Yeah, I agree. And I think now is, obviously we're still responding to COVID, but that's going to be around for a while. And I think, like we alluded to before, whilst many CEOs and executive teams are responding, and they have, their tactical teams who are sort of responding to that as well, it's the perfect time now to start thinking holistically and thinking wider in terms of, how can you set your business up and think differently, and start integrating resilience across all the business functions within your organization, and get it resilient ready, because, we are dealing with bushfires, and some, even those who haven't been particularly impacted by bushfires, COVID has absolutely impacted everyone, and there's got to be more disasters to come. It's more when, as opposed to if. Now, can I ask you, James, if we were going to be talking about CEOs and disaster resilience in 12 months' time, if we're going to be reflecting back on what's happened over the past 12 months of financial year 2021, what we'll be talking about? What will CEOs have done differently?
Well, I think, for me, it would be about embedding resilience into their business, but also across the whole, I'll call it, for a better word, supply chain and or systems within their business model. And we've got lots of evidence of CEOs putting on the agenda and transforming their business strategy and business planning to have, as business as usual, resilience and disaster risk embedded into the way they do their business. And you'll be able to test that both culturally as well as within their business strategies, and not just sitting nice glossy bits of paper sitting in a bookshelf. They're actually becoming living parts of their business.
And I wonder, do we need to be delivering them a flag so they can put it out the front?
Well, I do think it is a bit about the symbolism of these things. I'm probably the worst to say this, but the symbolism is about making sure that they actually, one, take the rewards of success of resilience and be prepared to be standing up front and center about why they did it and how they did it and what it meant to them, to their people, to their stakeholders. What does it mean to their, and whether that's for some a bottom line, or whether that's some for just a better return on investment or whatever it is. They've got to start to step up and start being proud of this stuff, and being an environment and a culture between collaborating. The thing I'd really like to see is the collaboration between government, community, and the business sector. Is that one is they may not always be aligned, but they are talking about the issues and solving them. Not just talking, but solving them and methodically working through how they work together better, but also understanding the needs of what they need in their business, to their communities, to their governments. How do they actually work? As I've said before, working together makes us stronger. Right now, we are all in slightly survival mode. And I think, in 12 months' time, particularly post-COVID, we've got massive economic impact, which will have a cultural and societal impact. How do we work together to solve these complex problems? Especially from an Australian perspective, we are often seen as, a small fish in a big pond. Well, the pond's just got bigger, and I think the fish has got a bit smaller. How do we actually work together to actually solve these issues?
James, dare I say it, I think you've just alluded to the Resilient Australia Alliance, which we are launching in October this year. Again, just for another podcast.
Yeah.
Now, so the whole premise of this podcast series is about doing disasters differently, because I have been saying since pretty much the first day I decided to set up corporate to community that if we don't start doing disasters differently, we are going to be stuffed, dare I say it, because the disasters are becoming more frequent, more destructive and compound. So not necessarily linked to CEOs, but you're welcome to include them. What are the two things that you'd like to be done differently in the disaster space?
I think for me, some of it's a bit about, we've had this conversation a few times about semantics of it all. But at the end of the day, the things I'd like them to do differently about disasters, whether it's individuals, businesses, CEOs, is to start thinking about what does a disaster mean to me? How do we actually broaden the all hazard approach? How do we think about these things strategically instead of operationally and tactically? We often say, oh, well, I've got a checklist and I'm happy, we're all cool. But businesses and CEOs particularly, but also individuals, how do we start to think about disasters? What does it mean to us? What does it mean to us as an individual, as a collective group, teams, stakeholders, CEOs? What does it mean to us? What does it really mean? Because often we can get caught up within the hyperbole of, the media release or the press release or some, whether it's 24/7 watching CNN about something. But we've got to bring it down to the two things we need to do differently is think about it differently, but also think about the opportunities of it, as well as preparing ourselves and building resilience to meet the impacts and consequences of disasters. But we've got to start thinking differently about it. We've got to look at the way we deal things differently, the way we look at culture, the way we look at our businesses, the way we look at, the way we even operate in our own communities. How do we, as members of individual communities, what do we need to do differently?
And I think if we weren't organically starting to think in that kind of way before, certainly bushfires, but more so probably COVID, just because it's obviously having a national impact. I think we're organically starting to kind of think differently about them and the consequences and the impacts that they directly or indirectly have to our livelihoods as well.
Yeah, and I think the other thing for me is I just hope what we don't do is recoil from them. We can often bunker down. Oh no, that don't look over to the left there. That never happened, or we did, or we handled. If I look at Australia's handling COVID up to this date has been pretty effective and efficient. I don't want us to celebrate it saying, oh, it's all over now. Aren't we done? Aren't we all champions? Unless we actually sit there and say, how do we learn from this, from compounding risk and compounding disasters and complex disasters? What do we need to do now to saying we're in the vortex of this thing right now? how do we embed that into making us more resilient, whether that's as an individual level, corporate level, community level, government level? How do we build resilience into our society and into our systems and into our businesses? Because that's the imperative bit for me anyway. Because we'll sit here in 5 years' time going, oh, that wasn't that wonderful, and it happens again. We don't know what we did. We don't know what we learned from it. We don't know what we did with it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, absolutely hoping that the changes and the learnings that have been discovered and experienced over the past few months actually sets us up and enables the train to resilience building to continue, as opposed to us bouncing back to, she'll be right, it's not going to happen to us, because obviously, as we're seeing what's happening at the moment, it absolutely will and can and very easily happen to us as well.
I think it's exactly right, Renae. I think the world of just, it happens to others, or she'll be right, mate, we're okay, are over.
Yeah, agree. And it's the compound disasters. It's not necessarily the first, it's the second and the third. And, that makes you question what is next to come. James, thank you so much for joining me. James Ritchie is the director of Thamani and he's a principal consultant at Corporate to Community as part of our collective. I certainly wouldn't be here today doing what I'm doing without you and your support and your contribution. And I can highly recommend, if you're listening to this, if you want to connect with James through LinkedIn or through corporatetoCommunity.com, please reach out. And I'm sure he'd be interested in a conversation. That's the end of this episode of Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast, which I hope you found to be relevant, informative, and inspiring. If you're interested in participating in the conversation or to connect with me personally, please visit corporatetoCommunity.com. Until the next episode, stay safe, and remember, we all have a role to play in thinking differently and doing differently before, during, and after disasters.